Thank you so much, Francis. Great to be here. This is a third time in Busan, and it gets better each time. Second time being hosted by KMI actually, because I visited KMI when they were in Seoul many years ago. So yeah, they are quite famous for their hospitality, as we saw last night and throughout this Congress workshop. So thanks for the Catfish Project for the opportunity to be here, and I wish I had participated in the last workshop in Malmo. I was just got caught up in many other things that we are doing in the Too Big to Ignore. But I take from the interaction and the conversation discussion you have here that it's been really rich in terms of the topics discussed. So I was actually asked to talk about small scale fisheries, but I feel that we have already done that since yesterday with Quentin talked about equity, with here talk about the role of communities, and of course throughout the conversation yesterday and also this morning, especially with Ife talking about women. So what I would try to do is basically to bring some of these together in a way to kind of round them up, especially for the topic today, which is about gaps, right? So from our perspective, especially from the small scale fisheries perspective, what are some of these, what some of the concerns that they may have about IUU interventions, or the rules and the regulations around these, and all the efforts to deter, prevent, eliminate, combat, whatever word you're using, including the kind of tracking system, etc. Right? So the starting point has to be really from the small scale fisheries perspective, and I think the conversation yesterday was like, so how do we define them? What do they look like, right? So those are some of the things that we from the research network also struggle with. FAO struggles with. Everybody is struggling with that. So you're in good company if you don't have a way to define small-scale fisheries. What it means is that when we deal with issues related to fisheries, whether it's IUU or others, you would think of that as a wicked problem. So this is a perspective that we have been using in order to help us better understand the kind of situation we're dealing with. And with that, we would be able to then think about how to deal with it in a better way. So I particularly used one of these governance perspective, which is an interactive governance. So I would talk a little bit about that and introduce it in a way that can help us better understand what's going on. And again, even though the context that I focus in is on small-scale fisheries, but I think it would invite, our conversation, discussion, and application into industrial large-scale fisheries and also the high sea fisheries. And I would wrap up with a little bit some of the thinking around information and data, simply because I think that's one of the topics that has been discussed here, and it might help us in thinking about what's next. So why we're talking about small-scale fisheries? Many of you would know that last year, 2022 basically was declared by United Nations as the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. So these are really important, and they have there's origins, right, of why the importance of small-scale fisheries, and they kind of wrap up in this vision statement. So basically people are trying to argue that there's a need to recognize the role and importance of small-scale fisheries for their many contributions, right? And it's important to think about how we could then support and promote small-scale fisheries in order for them to continue to contribute. But that is in the context always of sustainability and responsible fisheries. So indeed, they are small. They might be small in scale, relatively speaking, at least for some countries who's like, do we have small-scale fisheries, say in Norway, in Canada, where I work and live? there will be small scale fisheries. I believe there are small scale fisheries in most countries. There are just some small scale fisheries in some countries might be very big, and in others. So there's a lot of conversation, right, about how to really first look at small scale fisheries and understand them. So this is coming actually from, it's part of the big project that FAO and WorldFish and Duke University are working on in eliminating hidden harvest. But actually it came earlier report was actually a World Bank report that really talk about, big numbers in small scale fisheries. And you can, think about it, look at it, and again, when you present these kind of big numbers, you can take it either way. It's like very important, and we need to support and continue to promote and do a good job at managing the sector, or there are too many of them and we need to, they're too unruly, they are everywhere and they're difficult to manage, so you might as well get rid of them, right? So there's a little bit of that tension that might be happening when you see what's happening in small scale fisheries. When we started the Too Big to Ignore project in 2012, the aim has been to make small scale fisheries more visible, to make them less marginalized, to really give them that kind of prominent role in and a better understanding about them. And the question came, right? So what do you do once we know more about small scale fisheries? When you talk to governments, right? When you talk to policymakers, do they see small scale fisheries as a sector that should be supported and maintained and put in any kind of mechanisms and rules and regulations to make sure that they can maintain their contribution? Or it's the other way around, because governments are consumed and pretty much kind of mandated, right, to manage the fisheries. So when it comes to IUU fishing, and when you started to think about how that applies to small-scale fisheries, the conversation can get very difficult easily, simply because if almost by definition you can consider all small-scale fisheries IUU. So what do you do next, right? So it's difficult, right, to think about how to deal with this. But I'm inviting you, if you haven't taken a look at this, we talk a lot about, guidelines, conventions, agreements. This is another one, which is the one of those, it's voluntary, so it's not legally binding. Having said that, when you look at some of these principles that are being presented, that are included in these guidelines, and when you think about what small-scale fishing people can do when they want to take issue with government, they actually have more legal teeth than you would think, even though these guidelines are voluntary and non-legally binding. And this is a really good thing, right? Because they can't, by endorsing, adopting the guidelines and recognizing that there are rules and regulations and including legal framework in the country that actually are aligning with what is being said in the guidelines, you can actually go a long way. So this is not just about fisheries anymore. It's definitely not about small-scale fisheries alone, but this is about the society, the communities. When you think about decent work, when you think about social responsibility, so it goes to many facets of the society. So there might be labor law that is applicable to small-scale fisheries, even though it's not in the fisheries law or the acts. Right, and that's the kind of conversation that we want to see. I mean, human rights is a basic principle. It's a foundation for many of things that we do. So violating human rights, and we could argue that why do small-scale fisheries argue for fishing rights as human rights? Other occupation might do the same. Well, it would be good if we can all do that, actually, because the rights to livelihoods, the right to resources, the rights to to good well-being and other good things that we want everybody to have. It is a basic human right. So for the small-scale fisheries guidelines to include these kind of principles that you would not see in other contexts speak already to the nature and the characteristics of small-scale fisheries. And keep in mind that these guidelines have been, the way we develop the guidelines is actually in alignment with the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. So everything aligns, and therefore we should be able to use this kind of instrument to move forward and protect the rights and the livelihoods of small-scale fishing people around the world. But just like everything else, I mean, these, next year's, these were the guidelines were adopted in 2014 at the COFI meeting. Next year would actually be the 10th anniversary. So since we started the work, we have already looked at many countries and how, examples from around the world, basically, in terms of what's happening for countries to help implement the guidelines. So there's been a lot of progress. So next year is the 10th anniversary of the guidelines. So we're going to do another major assessment in terms of where we are. But implementation is challenging, just like everything else. Here is one of the challenges, right? Because you want to see definition of small-scale fisheries. Well, with the working group on small-scale fisheries that started, since 2003, and the conversation since then with the People Conference held in Thailand in 2008 that led up eventually to, the Congress that we organized on small-scale fisheries and eventually to the guidelines. Nobody attempts to define small-scale fisheries as such. It's a big blurb, right? It's a many aspects and elements that are part of this, and it's important to recognize that, right? So in the guidelines, there is no definition of small-scale fisheries. What it said is that we would let member state define small-scale fisheries according to your own law, legislation, or nature and characteristics or goals that you wanted to see, right? So when we did the first estimate of how many small-scale fisheries are there in the world, this was done in early 2000. It was difficult, but turned out, right, that at least 70% of countries around the world do know what small-scale fisheries look like and would have basically, a definition that they use, but mainly to manage the fisheries. So it's about differentiating between large-scale and small-scale. And most of the definitions would go into the size of the boat, maybe the gear, the engine power, maybe the area where they fish, right? So those are the kind of part of easy attributes that can be part of that definition, because it's, you can observe that, you can monitor and regulate that, right? But when it comes to things like, vessel, what do you call owner-operator system, you own and you operate your own boat. When it comes to members of household, family members engaging in small-scale fisheries, when it comes to the fish that you catch, in terms of what you do with it, is it for household consumption, or it's also through the value chain? Things get really complicated, right? And therefore, when we talk about small-scale fisheries, it's important that we recognize, at least, even if we are not able to put it in the legal definition, to look at that whole complex and diverse and dynamic, right? The dynamism in small-scale fisheries is actually quite important, because the law is static, right? Once you put it, it's there. Many things about small-scale fisheries are dynamic, right? So how do you really accommodate that? How to make sure that once you set the rules and regulations, they don't really affect how, the nature of small-scale fisheries. They're not, because there's no one small-scale fisheries, so you don't think of them necessarily as family-based alone. There's also firm-based, the enterprise. They are more commercialized. They might be even semi-industrial, but in the relative term, they're still considered small. Definitely not traditional. So some are, But there's a lot of modernization, there's a lot of gear and technological innovation. And for good reason, right? Safety is a good reason for that, right? We want to make sure that, they don't work in the risky situation. So they have to modernize their fleet, their boat, their gear too. So that's quite all right to see, right? And again, go back, look around. I mean, many of you are from developing countries, you know that they are small scale. But even if you're not from the global south, you would also note perhaps that there are small scale fisheries in your country. And again, this kind of gender role in small scale fisheries like go throughout the value chain. There might be more women in the post-harvest, but there's a lot of women who are also involved actively in the fishing activity themselves. Okay, so when you talk to them, when you ask small-scale fisheries what it means to fish, right? So you don't see the kind of metrics that we use to measure the importance and the values. It's not about money alone. It's, definitely they want that, but you would get other things as well. The sense of place. That's a fantastic, way to talk about it, right? Why people like to fish, because they feel that that's their place. They have that belonging, that sense of ownership, the freedom, right? And the community cohesion, for instance. So being in small-scale fisheries mean being part of a community. So this is not, they're not disconnected, right? So they are embedded. So things have more values and meaning. So how do we understand that and appreciate why they fish, as opposed to going with the metric that we usually use to organize our economic system, for instance. So I refer to this paper a lot, and this was written quite some time ago, but I just like the title, right? Every one of us like to come up with good title when we write a paper, right? And all the good titles are almost gone, but you can think of it still. Maybe there's many of the good titles we see in paper about IUU fishing as well. But this, I don't even need to say much, right? The image of what we are talking about is quite clear. Why you wanted to use a hammer if you're gonna want to paint a floor, and vice versa, right? What is a hammer for if it's not to do this thing, as opposed to trying to use it to paint? So it is about using a tool, right, that doesn't work in a situation that requires the tool. And mostly because we as researchers, right, we have our own favorite tools in our toolbox. Right? And this is why disciplinary training is a bit restricted. This is why the transdisciplinary training is actually important to embrace in the context of fisheries, and especially small-scale fisheries, and in the IUU fishing context too. Because we only know what we can do, right? Because we are trained to do this and that. We actually started to feel like, and this paper is good, right? Because it talks about marine protected areas, ecologists, conservation, biologists love that, right? I mean, everything we have a solution for, it's put an MPA and will solve all the world's problem. Economists might say, well, we have this thing called IQs or ITQs, individual transferable quotas, right? That's how we want efficiency, right? In the way we fish. So everybody should own your own quota, and therefore you do better job, and we wouldn't have these kind of the common problems that Hardin talked about. Even sociologists, right, do the same thing. We said community-based management, just like it's gonna solve everyone's problem. So we also at fault when it comes to all these concepts, and it is typical. And we promote it. I will be promoting very soon interactive governance, right? So we have our pet tools, approaches. What we want to do more of course, is to trying to broaden the thinking and see what we can learn when we started to think differently about things. And I learned that from reading this paper, right? The Ritter and Weber's paper on wicked problem. And it's for planners, huh? And planners would have that context, right? And we all at fault when it comes to this. We see problems, we think we've seen it already. We think of it as technical problem, scientific problem. There must be a way to solve it. It's a challenge, right? Because we, almost like inherently born to solve problems, right? Presenting to us. But from the TD perspective, what it means is that a problem might be seen or defined or perceived very differently depending on who does that, who a problem perspective of a problem depending on who defines the problem. A power to solve the problem also depends on who defines the problem, right? So IUU fishing is a problem, maybe, but defined by whom? So if it's defined by one one actor, one organization, one perspective, would be different when you started to talk about it. And of course, the solutions would also be different. And then the thing is, and then we think we have solved it, and then it turned out that by solving the IUU fishing problem, we might create other problems, even worse than IUU fishing. And I think we started to see that in the conversation we have had so far. So we end up chasing these, right, and trying to, figure it out, and as we go, how to do this, and so. But the final point is important, because when we make a mistake, right, it's costly. So we, as researchers, or as government, or as people not involved in fishing, we think we have solutions. We think we know how to fix the problem. And then when things don't work out the way we have planned, we are not affected by it. Okay, you might lose your job or you might not get promotion, but they are losing their livelihoods, and they, their way of making income and, access to the resources, the space, lots of things could happen, right? So we are not, after a while, we seem to be not responsible for the kind of mistake, which is too bad. So when we were working on this, right, we said, all of the problems that we've seen, they kind of sum up in this. IUU fishing might be seen as part of the sustainability, ecosystem health, talk about deterioration of resources, overfishing or illegal fishing, destructive fishing practices, etc. But there are more to that, right? There's social justice, there's livelihoods, there's food security. So when you started to add some of these concerns, they're not just one perspective, multiple concerns, different perspectives. What do you do, right? So they become that kind of complex problems that need a little bit a better understanding, cannot be fixed just by technical fixes. They're part of the wicked problem, like I said. And when we add to that climate change, right, and this is not my term, this is somebody else who said, it's now become super wicked problem. And you can, think of IUU kind of another, I don't know how wicked it is, but to some, it is quite difficult to deal with. Anyway, the point is, when small-scale fisheries are affected by these, there are, the problems becoming really the impact, the consequences are really high, because many of them are marginalized. They are sometimes, quite poor and already not receiving the kind of support that they have. Majority of the countries, even though they define small-scale fisheries, but they don't design fisheries policy and management according to small-scale fisheries nature and characteristics, because it's not easy to do. So we define we set rules and regulations, and we set up management system based on the minority of the fisheries. But they are large-scale industry, they organize, so it's easy to deal with. So we don't really think a lot about small-scale fisheries. But again, we have to remember that they are really important in terms of their contribution. Many of the countries around the world, if you remove small-scale fisheries, I think we would have a breakdown in the society. There would be a lot of people who are not taken care of. They would have food security problem. There'll be poverty. There'll be labor, employment issue. There would be even riot in the communities. Lots of things could happen. Okay, so moving a little bit quickly into this interactive governance theory, because again, you can read a lot about this, and we kind of have to put in definition here. But the most important thing, maybe I put two so that you can read it together. It is kind of true that we don't manage the fish or the fisheries, but we manage, again, I mean, I kind of like with this definition of interactive governance, you would think that it's not really about managing the people. It's actually about managing with people. That's a Really important difference. So when you hear people say, "Oh, we don't manage the fish, we manage the people," I said, "No, you mean we manage with people." Because all these actors are part of that management and governance system. So it's not government managing the fish. It's government and other actors, including fishing people, industry, and community groups and environmental organizations that are governing the fisheries together. So from management to governance is pretty straightforward. If management is like a first order thing, things that is the technical stuff, things that we do because we know how to do. You can learn to become a manager, and you know that you have these tools, you have these approaches, you have this framework. Governance is a bit broader than that, right? So it has to think about what we call the second order and the third order. How to design and structure institutions so that they would facilitate the work in the first order. But then even more than that, what are some of the principles that should inform those institutions? Rules and regulations have to be set and designed according to some principles, right? So remember the guidelines. There's a set of principles. In all these, all that what we are trying to do, we live by principles. But what we don't do is use the principles to inform how we design institutions at the second order. I've been talking about organizations and rules and regulations. And then if we are able to do that, we hardly need to do anything at the first order. It just comes, right? That's in principle, at least. Doesn't always work like that. So they are quite, there's a pretty complex theory, but you can see that you can kind of relate to them because something you're familiar with. Starting, for instance, from the node of governance. So we have to know, right, that some countries is top-down, some countries, a lot to do with a lot of co-governance, collaboration, participation from various actors, and sometimes we have self-governance as well. The orders of governance, I already mentioned that a little bit, but this is really important to think about. There's 3 orders of governance that is happening in the space that we operate in. But the governance elements is another thing that also need attention. What is it that we are doing? Is it like, I'll bring some of these together, to introduce to you, especially about images, because actions we know how to do. Then we have instruments. What we don't think of is images that are, underlying some of these development of the instrument and these actions. Just some examples, right? So the study we did that looked at about 30-some countries around the world actually showed that there's a lot of transition at the moment, and some transformation even, right? But this is important to note, right? There's so many types of governance arrangement, right? The mode of governance, again, even this is not a static. It has that kind of evolving nature to it. And countries are trying to move, right, from sticking with the top-down hierarchical arrangement and working only at the first order, which is just about managing the fisheries. I mean, we are faced with problems on a daily basis. And we have to figure it out sometimes very quickly how to deal with it. So we are very good at bringing our managerial tools to do this. And if we have the top-down government, we have line agencies who would be tasked, right? They have mandates, responsibility. So that is actually quite a good place to start, but easy place to start, and doesn't help us necessarily to deal with the complex problems we're faced with. So many countries are moving diagonally and also in all these different quadrants into different types of governance. So you can think about it yourself in terms of efforts in your country, in terms of what you're trying to do. The participation and engagement with stakeholders, fishery stakeholders in our context, has become a very common thinking. You see that, in Thailand, the same way we have Fisheries Act that is very old in 1940 some. When you write the new one, the first thing they put is engagement with stakeholders, participation. Same in Canada. So many countries are doing that. So you see that there's a trend, right? There's almost like fashionable almost, right? To add this context of participatory governance or engagement with stakeholders. So this kind of moving into that, co-governance is actually happening in many places around the world, which is a good thing. We have to recognize so that it might not work in the same way. So you need to look at whether there is enabling environment for participation. Fishers are busy. Sometimes they cannot just leave their work and come and meet and join the committee. So you need to make it possible for people to engage and contribute. So when it comes to order, again, this is actually some of the questions that you can think of, because we have to force ourselves. It's not natural for us to think necessary at the meta order. But if we can invite that, right, first it's about what principles that we believe in and we wanted to go by. So this is really about, the ethics, the morality, things that are assumed, implicit, but not explicit, right? And it's hard to make them explicit. But we cannot assume that we would all agree. So therefore, we need an exercise to articulate what these principles are and how we can use them to effectively, so that they would not violate or ignore the rights of small-scale fisheries or their needs and their characteristics, right? And again, there are a lot of feedback into each other. So you can imagine that you can start from the first order, go up the order, and then you can do this trickle-down process as well. So things get better, basically, as we do this exercise, difficult as it sounds. But, just like everything else, practice helps us, make us better. So you could go through this and see what kind of questions. Even asking questions is important, right? Because we don't ask the same questions. So questions being asked, again, is the same thing as the way we frame problems. Who frames the problem actually has more power to decide what's happening. So we want to broaden opportunities, right? For everyone, inclusive opportunity for everyone to think about it. Okay. Image, one of the elements that I would talk about is images, and I was gonna, this is actually, I'm promoting marine policy for Quentin. I'm part of the editorial board here, but it's a very good journal, of course, right, to learn about different things. And this paper in particular is an attempt to, it's a very provoking in terms of why we use the term blue justice. When people talk blue economy. And there are many blues out there, by the way. They're all supposed to talk about good stuff. Blue economy invite a lot of conversation about what we can do, given that the ocean is unlimited in terms of what it can produce, in terms of the economy. There's a lot of industry sectors. There's a lot of things that we can take from the ocean. What we bring in with this paper is about justice, which is to suggest, right, that you can take, but it has to be just. Small-scale fisheries can be part of that blue economy, even though even fisheries are not really discussed in blue economy. It's oil and gas industry. It's shipping and mining. It's renewable energy. It's a lot of other things, but not fisheries. So you can see that we're being squeezed out of that conversation. Ocean, I don't believe that it's unlimited in terms of the resources. We know that already. And the space is also not as vast, right? So there's a lot of competition for at least, place that we want, that fishers can access. So there's a lot going on. Blue justice is a call to, right, recognition that we can think of development, blue economy. We can think of sustainable economy for the ocean, but it has to be based on justice and equity as principle. Otherwise, we get into this situation, right? So we were just playing with some of these terms and the glossary, right? In this glossary, in this paper. But is important to use some of these terms and concepts and play with that a little bit so that it is clear to people that, one attempt to do something can be actually seen, perceived, and conceived in a very negative way, right? So we have even participation, right? It could become participatory domination because again, this is power play here. You got more voice, you got more representation, then you dominate the conversation. There's lots of things happening. So by putting up some of these terms and understanding about how fishers perceive what's happening in the development of the ocean, in the development of the fisheries, you started to understand where they're coming from, and that changing the image, right? So we have to be a bit mindful when we use images, actual images, infographic, for instance, to call attention to some of these. It might be misleading. It might be interpreted quite differently. Okay, so the last part here, I'm gonna just wrap up with these. You might have seen these because my Daniel Polly did this quite a while back, and I think there have been revised version of these. But the point is, small-scale fisheries also have to be looked at in the context of large-scale fisheries, right? So you could use a lot of metrics to think about differences and comparing between large scale and small scale. Of course, when you look at it from one perspective, one metric, it might be that one fisheries, large scale, dominate in terms of certain things. But when you look more broadly and bring other perspectives, you can start to see a different picture. In our work, we would also even go beyond that. And it's important to talk about this because what we go for is something that we can count, right? A metric we can use to measure. And that's why this IUU fishing looks like what we see today when we're trying to deter it, prevent it, etc. We go with something that we know we can measure. We know they can monitor. We know we can count. A lot of things that are happening in small-scale fisheries or even in large-scale fisheries don't have that nature. Some of them are even unknown, which is quite all right. There's a concept, right? The known, the unknown, the unknowable. So there are things that we will never know. That is okay. But what we should not do is trying to make things that really are not that easy to know, but then we said we're just going to know whatever is easy to measure. That is just going to get us a fraction of what we need to know. So there's a lots of questions and the type of data that we need to think about, right? So some of the relevant questions then, right, in terms of data. So what is considered IUU in small-scale fisheries, might be different. So it has to be that, one of the first questions that we need to ask, and whether it has been considered as such. I think we heard that before. Today you fish, you do everything you used to do, same that you did yesterday. Yesterday was okay, today is illegal, right? I mean, we as human, as citizen of any country, we know too, right? I mean, if you drive, I can bet you that all of you have driven above the speed limit. So we are doing things, right, that are not necessarily following all the rules and the law. And you might decide that, well, they changed the rule on us. Yesterday there was, speed limit was 50 and now it's 60. So how will we know? So things that are, one day to the next might change. We have to recognize that. And again, as I said before, it's also about according to whom. Now, if and when we think that IUU fishing happens in small-scale fisheries, we have to think about, so do we know why it happens, right? And before we start to think about we need to do something about it, let's try to figure that out. Do we know why it happens? And you can argue that people have reasons for doing it. Like I said, we might speed over the limit because we are in a rush to get to our meeting or whatever, right? So having reason doesn't mean that they justify the behavior. Having reason is basically to help us understand why it happens, right? And it's important to do that. So when we talk about data that we want to have, right, when we put in any tracking monitoring system, because we have reasons to collect the data. You know that there's a lot of data that's been collected and they're never used in all government departments. You know, we actually are going to be doing a project that help improve data collection in small-scale fisheries. The first question is, what are you collecting already, and what do you do with the data that you collect? And it's actually interesting. Almost more than half of the data collected are not being used, right? So we have to think about why we collect data, what to collect, and what to do with it. And whether the system that we use to collect the data, and this would also go to many systems that we develop, whether it's suitable or not, right? Because if small-scale fisheries spread out around the coast, they can take place even in a creek somewhere, and there's so many of them. What do you do, right? How to set a system that would be applicable. And then when you recognize that we might actually need help from small-scale fisheries to improve data, to really make the data collection system work, then think about why they should do it. What would be the incentive, right? Okay, I'll close with this in terms of final thoughts, and this is again something that I picked up from some of the conversation we have had already, but also based on what we have been observing. Just don't trying to treat it as a simple problem, and use the tools that we know, but let's broaden our toolbox a little bit. And don't be too quick on treating the problem that we see the same way, especially from the large scale and small scale. So we are serious about addressing IUU fishing problems in small scale fisheries. Don't start from let's use whatever work or what we think might work in the large scale fisheries into small scale. Not right away. Okay. And understanding IUU fishing problems in all order of governance, and also thinking about solutions that might actually be found in any of those orders of governance would also help us. Changing the image is also about narrative, right? We have to recognize that it's again, who owns the narrative has the power to influence. So image about small-scale fisheries and the narrative about small-scale fisheries is important. If you see them as a problem, then we need to get rid of them. But if you see them as a solution, then we have to figure it out how to support them. And of course, the final points already said about the need to design the system, including the governance system, appropriately, so that we can do a good job at supporting small-scale fisheries and taking care of IUU fishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ratana. Always very insightful to listen to you. And particularly, I think we often tend to start to get more uncomfortable with increasing complexity, but I think what Ratana is saying is get comfortable with complexity and start to just systematically investigate it. And I think that's what we're all trying to do here. I'm sure there's many questions. We have time for, we have at least 10 minutes of question time, so please, the floor is open. Yeah, we have one from Senegal.
Thank you very much for your cooperation. My name is Sheikh Fall. I'm the head of Inspection and Control Division in the Ministry of Fisheries of Senegal. Thank you very much for your presentation. Like you say, if you remove small-scale fisheries in the sector, we make a break. It's a reality in Africa context or in West Africa or context, because we have a big capacity of fisheries and a big capacity of small boat. For example, in Senegal, we have more than 20,000 small boat, and 80% are landed by the small-scale fisheries. Therefore, more impact in the wrong way about IU fishing. IU fishing, if you tell IU fishing, automatically we think the big boat. But in West Africa, IU fishing is a reality in the small scale fisheries because more quantity of product landed and more impact. I think it's better for it's necessary to promote co-management in this subsector to work together with the fisheries cooperation and administration, and also possibility to have VMS or IS for the small scale, for the small boat, possibility to monitor the marine protected area, to monitor the fishing area of this small boat. That is my compliment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And in that case, why do you have yet a way to define IUU according to your country? Because IUU by definition, the original definition, is really not applicable, right, for the small scale fisheries. It's not meant to be. It was intended more for distant water, for kind of like industrial fleet. So if you feel that small scale fisheries dominate the fisheries in your country, which is the case in many countries actually, then we have to figure it out. How would we define IUU according to your context? And I think that's important to do. So that way you don't get into a situation where you're bringing in these IUU policy interventions that are used broadly and trying to fit, right, your context to that definition. So I think I would invite you to, think about how would you think about IUU in the fisheries, in the small-scale fisheries context. And it's the same thing with you saying about how small-scale fisheries contribute to making MPA work. They would also, if you do it properly, with the cooperation, participation, and the co-management, they could also address IUU fishing. It's not that dissimilar. So I think that's great that you recognize that point. But I would encourage you to invite, to engage with all the actors to see if we can think about IUU in Senegal that fits the context.
Thank you. I think we have a question down the front here from Kathleen Auld of World Maritime University.
Great, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Very, very interesting. My question is actually also about co-governance and co-management. As you said, these arrangements really need to be structured carefully and carefully designed to work properly and effectively to address IUU fishing, but also to share resources equitably. But in a lot of cases, they're almost being seen by governments as a sort of panacea for many of the issues in small-scale fishing. So I guess my question really is how, in your opinion, should governments approach these the creation of these arrangements? I mean, what sort of mindset do they need to go into the creation of these arrangements with in order for them to be effective?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's important, right? Because in Canada, when you bring in the word co-management, the fishing industry started to get very angry because co-management in the context of Canada, it turned out to be downloading the responsibility and even the cost of management to the fishing industry. Which is unfortunate, right? Because the principle is a well designed in terms of why we need to bring in various actors and people who actually would understand better what's going on in this context, right? So an arrangement that we have seen a lot is actually this kind of committee, which is like more like a local committee to manage areas. You've seen that. In many countries in Africa and also in the Pacific, right? They use this local management area. So it is about recognizing that people, and this is applying the adjacency principle, and the subsidiarity principle. So two things. Adjacency means that people who live in a place, they have, more reason to want things to work in that place, right? And they have rights and, pretty much ownership even, right, of that space. Subsidiarity means that, when things can be managed at the lowest possible unit, that's where things should take place. So if we feel that, things are so complex, there's a lot going on, and we might not have all the knowledge to do something with, and we would have to assume that people who live there, work there, and depend on the resources can contribute to that conversation, right? So therefore, we could have this committee, right, which is kind of an arrangement that could help thinking. At least, there could be they would have to connect, of course, to the ministerial level, or at least the decision making. So having a lot of these local committees, you need to have them connected, right? You have to be able to connect them in order to, escalate that kind of conversation, discussion to the national level decision making. Eventually, you might want to even enable some of the decisions to have them taken place at the local level. Now, governments are not necessarily keen on that because, just like all of us, right? You got power in your hand. The minute you have to let it go, you feel really bad, like can't sleep, which is like, I don't know why, but, so there's a little bit going on there. So I think we have to learn how to trust and respect each other in terms of knowledge as well. This is, again, about TD, people who know best about what's going on, they are the experts. We are just technical experts, but they are the real experts. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions? Yeah, there's one from at the back there. Oh, right. Maybe there's a gentleman just at the back there with I think from Fiji.
Thank you very much, Madam, for that very informative presentation. Just very quick questions. I have learned a lot in terms of relevant information regarding IUU and especially small-scale fisheries. And I realized that in Samoa and other Pacific countries, small-scale fisheries is one of the fundamental tool for fisheries management, especially food security and livelihood, and also economic benefits. So I'm just wondering, with a lot of these very relevant informations and also challenges, if it is possible for this catfish project to provide these lessons learned and these challenges to scale up small-scale fisheries and IUU fishing. That's my question. Thank you.
Is it your question or my question?
I think if you wanted to tackle it in the first instance, I can have a comment after.
I'm not sure about the scaling up in terms of what is it that you think we should be doing again in the scaling up? Scaling up the effort to combat IUU fishing. Is that? Or it's the scaling up of small-scale fisheries? So that...
Yeah, scaling up of small-scale fisheries. Scale up, perhaps looking at how to improve and how to better manage small-scale fisheries. That's what I mean by scaling up.
Right, yeah, because small scale, it's about scale, right? So when you say scaling up, I'm starting to like, but I'm telling you because, this is what we have to recognize, right? We cannot think of small scale fisheries as like a, we cannot be romanticizing small scale fisheries, that's a word, right? Because they have to modernize. They have to to be able to take on the new technology, they have to be able to use gear that can help them do better at their job, at their practice. So and safety issue especially, right? We know that. But there is a limit for everybody, not just small scale fisheries. There's always limit for industrial large scale fisheries as well. What we've seen so far, this is exactly how we go about managing and governing our fisheries resources, right? We rely a lot on cooperation of vessels, of industries, to agree on set of principles, set of convention and agreements, right? Because then we need to be able to work together to manage the fisheries. So let's agree on that. That's what the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries is about, right? Trying to encourage member states, country to do better job at managing the resources. And the group that we can work with easily, a group that we can identify easily, which are the industry people, because we have already put in licensing, permitting, lots of schemes, lots of instruments, so that we know who they are. And they're smaller in number, right? But when it comes to small-scale fisheries, there are many more. So if a country has more of the small-scale fisheries, then it should be a common thing for you to do. But what you should not do is to take whatever works in countries where they have small-scale as minority. So you have to imagine that even people teaching stock assessment, right? People teaching modeling exercise, they are trained, they are from places where there are not many small-scale fisheries. So then we send people, right? We send our researchers and professors to study in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in the US, right? So, and many of them learn how to do things according to countries that do not have small-scale fisheries, or at least not in the tropical system, where you got multi-species, multi-gear, and lots of livelihoods, food security, and other concerns. So we have to recognize that. So going back to catfish, right? It's about capacity building. So capacity needs to be built for the people who actually need to deal with the situation, so that we don't borrow and transfer knowledge without contextualize it better. So I think, and as a short answer for your country, for what you're asking, is use your knowledge, the knowledge of the people first, and forget the experts, because I don't think they know more than you do about what's going on in your country.
Yeah, and so I would agree to that. All that I would possibly add to it is that, and not always, but quite often, these small-scale fisheries are quite informal in terms of recording of information, in terms of the whole economy behind them. And this is perhaps something that needs to be seriously addressed, so that we can start to understand the value chains and the supply chains behind it, and start to understand how that tier behind the sort of frontline fishers is actually perhaps influencing overfishing or illegal fishing in some ways. We tend to just look at the fishers, but then there's the buyers and the sellers behind that, and so on. So I think it's getting at that information that really needs to be understood in a better way for the small scale fisheries. In terms of scaling up, yeah, it's small-scale fisheries are what they are, and again, I think it's more about understanding that business dynamic behind the small-scale fisheries that is about the kind of scaling up, if you like, if that's what's driving overfishing or what's driving illegal fishing. I think that's an important area to get to, and I think it started to arise with the discussions about gender aspects of fisheries and the role of the women processors and sellers in many of the small-scale fisheries of developing countries. So That's just my perspective. Perhaps Rana, you would like to come back on that?
No, I just need to say something about the informality that you mentioned. This is actually discussed a lot at the when we were working on the text of the small-scale fisheries guidelines, and you know that the IUU was mentioned in the guidelines, but not in a context of informal sector, simply because small-scale fisheries, there's always going to be some informality about small-scale fisheries. So this is really important to note, because informality in small-scale fisheries, it should not be related, it's not, doesn't mean illegal. There's a big difference, right? Because we want small-scale fisheries to maintain some of that informality, because there's a lot of informal ways of operating, right, about small-scale fisheries, including post-harvest. You know, people don't put every fish through the value chain. That doesn't mean that they are selling things under the table, necessarily, right? It is about, lots of things that are happening in small-scale fisheries that are part of that informal way of going about things. So it's a very important distinction to recognize that, sometimes we want to maintain that informality, because we know that it should not be legalized, everything. So there's a...
And I think that possibly goes to the point raised about the situation in Senegal, whereby the small-scale fisheries, or I'm not so sure about Senegal, but certainly in Ghana, the small-scale artisanal fleet is actually landing a higher percentage of commercial catch than is the industrial fisheries. So when you get to that level of catch and value, to have that whole side of the fisheries economy in an informal basis, obviously, creates big problems with reporting, creates big problems with collecting appropriate data for any kind of scientific approaches to it. So that's my only point, is that if it's a genuinely small scale, but if it's a huge lot of small scale, then you get into that, you have to confront that situation, I think.
No, I agree. And illicit trade is not like informal transaction either. So yeah.
Okay, do we have any final closing question? One from Rafael from WMU down the front, please.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. I will just try to bring a little bit the question that Kathleen was asking, but from a different perspective. Because the perspective that was brought before and the perspective we've seen a lot was very much from the land side. Now I would like to have the perspective from the sea side, from the fisher side, because as was mentioned previously by Clive, the land dominates the sea. What does it mean, in fact, the lands dominate the sea? It means that for decades, centuries, the history shows very clearly a top-down approach. It shows also an elimination of small-scale fisheries. I'm thinking about all developed countries, which has been a radical elimination of it. It means also that this radical elimination benefit to the industrialization of fisheries, which is also a tendency that we see in most of the developing countries. In this context, what happened? It means that there have been a lot of neglect, a lot of disregard, stigmatization of what is a fisher. I like very much the idea of fisher phobia. I think it's very clear. It's very clear. Fisher phobia is not only from the people on land. Fisher phobia is something that at sea you feel. You feel that you are not hated. You are hated by the society. You feel it. It's a feeling that you have when you are working at sea. That the society doesn't like you, doesn't trust you, and is always against you and try to regulate any of your move. And you feel it. It's really a strong feeling. And in this respect, knowing this feeling and knowing the fishers have this feeling, knowing the seafarers have this feeling of this domination by land, trying to enforce what they want, how can you build trust to have this cooperation, to really have this dynamic cooperation? How can you build trust? How can you build empowerment? And can you also tell us how can you overcome the risks that highlighted by Francis, that the society is also needs to control at a certain level, but maybe needs also to support and not let the fishers be in a constant instability in their livelihood, making them doing what's happening at small scale, but also at a higher scale. Higher scale is a little bit different, but how can you convince them to work together, and how can you demonstrate your willingness to support them? And not demonstrating in terms of words, in terms of actions.
Very, that's such a great question, right? Because in you know, we can think about it in theory, but in practice it's always different, right? And so trust and relationship building, I think it's like a family. It's like things that could happen in a family. So if we apply what we would do in our family to a fishery with fishing people, I think that might be a good way to start. That would mean that we have to be somewhat forgiving in sometimes, maybe even forgetful in some cases, just to get things going, right? Because you can't always do everything right. And people don't, you know, you feel like you being attacked all the times, everything you do is always wrong, nobody like it. And then you think that government is there to get you all the time, right? So it's not easy. It's almost like relationship that, I don't know, you know, we started to have with certain group, and we stereotype the people, right? So it go both ways. So I think it's almost like a therapy that you almost need to have first. But I think somebody put in political will as one of the important points to, you know, to really express. So you're gonna have to yield a lot more. So that's, if the starting point is already a disadvantaged position, so you need to do more. Or you need to be in an overcompensation stage, I think. So things that you would not do otherwise, I think you need to do more, simply because you need to overcompensate in order to reconcile. And then once you are really on the even playing field, then we can start to recognize that everybody can do things in an equal. So this is really important, because if they have been disadvantaged, right? I mean, a lot of policies in many countries around the world are trying to address that groups that are previously disadvantaged or marginalized, right? So if that is happening, so there's going to be a long, and you know, Canada is not doing a good job yet, but we're trying to make people feel like here they are again being respected, and they can start trusting the government. But it's going to take work. But you know, generosity from everybody, and empathy and compassion would go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a very good note to end this morning's sessions on. So a round of applause once again for Rana.